History is often written by the victors, but it is felt by the ghosts. In 1918, the Bolsheviks attempted a clinical extraction to remove the Romanov family from the Russian narrative, as if they had never existed. They scrubbed the floors, burned the clothes, and lied to the world for 7 decades. But you cannot execute a legacy. Tonight, we trace the echoes of the Ipatiev house. From the diamonds sewn into corsets that acted as unintended armor, to the DNA sequences that finally ended a century of shadows. This is the Romanov escape that history erased. Welcome back to Whispered Chronicles, Echoes of Forgotten Lore. Sometime in the 3rd week of July 1918, a rumor began moving westward across the telegraph wires of Europe. It arrived in London, dressed as fact. The Tsar had been shot, the dispatches said, shot alone, in secret, by order of the Bolshevik Regional Soviet. But his family, the Empress, the 5 children, they had been moved somewhere safe, somewhere north. The story was plausible enough to be printed. The Times ran it. So did papers in Paris and Berlin. Nicholas II was dead, yes, but Alexandra was alive. The boy Alexei was alive. The 4 Grand Duchesses, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, were alive. The rumor was wrong on almost every point. But it had a life entirely its own, and that life would outlast empires. It's outlast the Soviet state that tried to manage it. It's outlast the 20th century itself. Because when you kill a family in secret and bury them badly, you do not end the story, you begin it. To understand what happened in a basement in Yekaterinburg on the night of July 16, 1918, you have to understand how far those people had fallen, and how fast. 3 years before that night, Nicholas II was the autocrat of all the Russias. His empire stretched across 11 time zones. He controlled more land than any single ruler on earth. The Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, his official residence, had 1,500 rooms. The corridors were hung with paintings that took a week to walk past. His daughters wore dresses embroidered by serfs' descendants. The Empress Alexandra suffered from what her doctors could not adequately explain. She turned for comfort to a Siberian mystic named Rasputin, which the court found embarrassing and the press found irresistible. His son Alexei bled in ways that would not stop. It was hemophilia, inherited through Alexandra from her grandmother, Queen Victoria of England. Nicholas was not a cruel man. He was, by most accounts, a gentle one. He liked the outdoors. He kept a diary with the attentiveness of someone who genuinely believed the small details of life were worth recording. On days when history cracked open beneath him, his diary noted the weather. This was not stupidity. It was perhaps a kind of emotional armor, refusal, willed or unwilled, to fully inhabit the catastrophe that was his reign. The First World War killed his empire more surely than any revolutionary pamphlet. Russia lost men at a scale that the mind cannot properly process. Millions dead, supply lines that collapsed before they reached the front. An officer class that was brave but limited, and a czar who went personally to command an army he was not equipped to lead. By tying himself to the war's outcome, Nicholas tied the Romanov dynasty to whatever came next. What came next was 1917, first a revolution in February that nobody planned, which toppled Nicholas almost by accident. The bread queues in Petrograd turned into marches. The marches turned into a movement, and the Tsar abdicated in a railway carriage with a dignity that looked to some like relief. Then a second revolution in October, which the Bolsheviks very much did plan, which ended the provisional government and delivered power to Lenin and the party. Nicholas and his family were placed under house arrest at the Alexander Palace in Tsarskoye Selo. They were then moved. In the summer of 1917, to Tobolsk, in western Siberia, ostensibly for their safety, as the political temperature in Petrograd rose past the point where their presence felt manageable. They lived in the governor's house with a reduced staff. Nicholas chopped wood in the yard. The children put on plays. They attended church when permitted. Alexei was tutored. Life contracted around them, and they tried to fill it. Then came the spring of 1918, and the civil war that fractured the country into competing armed factions. The White Army, fighting to roll back the Bolshevik Revolution, was advancing. Tobolsk started to feel exposed. Local Bolshevik committee sent soldiers. There were arguments between Moscow and the regional Soviets about who had authority over the prisoners. In April, a commissar named Vasily Yakovlov arrived to move the family. The decision, ultimately, was Yekaterinburg. Yekaterinburg sits in the Ural Mountains, which are not dramatic mountains. They are old and worn, more ridge than peak. It was a Bolshevik stronghold, a city of workers and factories. And the local Soviet there was among the most radical in the country. The man who would become the family's chief jailer was Yakov Yurovsky, a former watchmaker and committed Bolshevik, who took over as commandant of the Ipatov house on July 4, 1918. The Ipatov house was a merchant's home, requisitioned, and hastily fortified. A tall wooden fence was built around it, blocking the window's view of the street. The family was assigned rooms on the upper floor. Guards occupied the lower floor and outbuildings. The windows on the upper floor had been whitewashed from outside, so the family could not see out. Their world had become this whitewashed glass, a small garden permitted for exercise. Nicholas exercised. Alexandra, whose health had deteriorated, spent much time in a wheelchair. The children tried to keep two routines. Lexi was carried when needed by his father. Anastasia, the youngest daughter at 17, was described as sharp-tongued and funny, a form of endurance. They brought with them what they had been able to carry: jewelry, some of it sewn into clothing, icons, books, a small dog, Jimmy, a King Charles Spaniel belonging to Anastasia. They also brought Alexi's spaniel Joy. These are not trivial details. Jimmy would survive the night that killed his owners. The order to kill the Romanovs came from Moscow. That much is now established. For decades, the Soviet government maintained the decision had been made locally. We know better now because Soviet archives, opened after 1991, contain telegrams and testimony. These trace the decision upward to Yakov Sverdlov, and beyond him, to Lenin himself. The operational planning was given to Yurovsky. The rationale was military and political in equal measure. The Bolsheviks could not allow the Tsar to be liberated and become a rallying point. There was also the matter of what a living Romanov family might represent to European monarchies. Dead, the family was a problem to be managed. Alive, they were a crisis waiting to happen. Yurovsky began his preparations days in advance. He arranged for a truck, identified a site in the forest, abandoned mine shafts near Koptyaki, organized a disposal team separate from the men who would carry out the killing, and he briefed his inner circle, a small group of trusted Cheka operatives. The family was not told what was coming. There is no recorded testimony that suggests foreknowledge. On the evening of July 16th, they went to bed as they had gone to bed on previous nights. At approximately midnight, Yurovsky woke the family. He told them, through the maid Anna Demidova, that they needed to dress and come downstairs. There had been shooting in the town, he said, and it was safer in the lower rooms. This was a lie. They dressed. Nicholas carried Alexei, who was having difficulty walking due to his condition. The family came downstairs with 4 of their remaining servants: Dr. Eugene Botkin, Demidova, Ivan Karatanov, and Alexei Trupp. Yurovsky led them through a series of corridors and into a semi-basement room. A room with a vaulted ceiling, a barred window on one wall, and a floor of wooden boards laid over earth. There was no furniture. Yurovsky later said that Alexandra asked for chairs. 2 were brought in. She sat in one. Alexei sat in the other. Nicholas stood beside his son. What happened next is documented in a remarkable primary source, the Yurovsky Note, dictated to a party official in 1920 and later elaborated in a 1934 speech. Yurovsky was a systematic man, even in retrospect about a massacre. His account is not remorseful. It is procedural. He entered the room with 11 armed men. Some accounts say 10. The figure varies in testimony. He read a short statement. The Western European bourgeoisie and its Russian allies had attempted to rescue the Romanovs, and the regional Soviet had therefore ordered their execution. Nicholas, according to Yurovsky's account, turned to face his family and then turned back and said, "What? What?" He did not finish the question. Yurovsky fired first. It assigned each gunman a specific target in advance. The room was small, somewhere around 4 meters by 5. 11 men firing in an enclosed space created conditions of almost immediate chaos. The smoke from the guns thickened the air within seconds. Several of the killers flinched or fired wildly. The noise was overwhelming. The death of Nicholas and Alexandra appears to have been relatively quick. Several of the servants and at least one daughter died quickly. But the killing of the other children took far longer than Yurovsky had planned, and this was the detail that would haunt the event. The Grand Duchesses and Alexei did not die immediately from the first volley of shots. Yurovsky, in his note, is almost clinical about this. The girls were found to be alive after the initial shooting and had to be killed by other means. Bayonets were used, then pistols fired at close range. One account describes the scene as lasting more than 20 minutes before it was finished. The reason for this grotesque prolongation was the jewels. In the weeks and months before this night, Alexandra and the Grand Duchesses had sewn diamonds, pearls, and other stones into their clothing, not as ornamentation but as portable wealth, against the hope that they might someday need resources to flee or bargain. These improvised vests of gems were never intended to be ballistic protection, but that is effectively what they became. The stones deflected or slowed bullets. The Yurovsky note references this directly. When the bodies were later stripped for burial, the concealed treasure was discovered. Jewels embedded in fabric, jewels that had been stitched into the seams with the hands of frightened women in a fortified house, never imagining the precise use to which they would be put. By 2:30 in the morning of July 17th, 11 people were dead in the room. Nicholas, Alexandra, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, Alexei, Botkin, Demidova, Karatanov, and Trupp. The bodies were wrapped in sheets. A truck had been waiting. The disposal team drove into the forest before dawn. They headed to the area of the Koptyaki mine shafts. The original plan was to lower the bodies into the shafts, flood them with sulfuric acid. But the acid was not available in sufficient quantities. Yes, the shafts were not as deep as hoped. The plan changed, as improvised plans do, mid-execution. The bodies were partially buried in one location, then disinterred and moved. Faces were destroyed to impede identification. The remains of 2 of the 11 were separated from the main group. Alexei and one of the daughters, either Maria or Anastasia, were burned, then buried separately. This decision, made on the spot by exhausted and panicked men, would have consequences that lasted for a century. By morning, the Ipetev house had been cleaned. Yurovsky made his report to Moscow. The White Army arrived in Yekaterinburg 8 days later and found an empty house with scrubbed floors and a small dog wandering the yard. The Soviet government announced the death of Nicholas on July 19th. The announcement said only that the former Tsar had been shot. His family, it stated, had been moved to a place of safety. This was the first official lie, and it was a lie with extraordinary staying power. Why did Moscow choose this particular fiction? The political calculus was probably this: the killing of a deposed ruler was defensible, in the language of revolutionary necessity. The killing of women, of children, of a sick boy, that was harder to frame, harder to sell to an international audience that had not yet been fully lost, and harder to defend even within the party. To those who still believed in proportionality, so the family disappeared into official silence, not confirmed dead, not confirmed alive, just removed from the narrative. This silence was, for the purposes of legend, ideal. The claimants began arriving within a few years. Most were dismissed quickly, impostors claiming to be Nicholas himself, or one of the elder daughters, whose faces had been too well documented by too many people to be easily appropriated. The youngest daughter was different. Anastasia was 17 in 1918. She was not as photographed as her elder sisters. She was known for a particular quality of mercurial personality, for humor and irreverence, and these were characteristics that could be performed rather than verified. The myth of Anastasia's survival had specific conditions that made it hospitable to a particular kind of claim. In February 1920, a young woman was pulled from a canal in Berlin. She had tried to drown herself or had fallen. Accounts differed. She carried no papers and would not say her name. She was taken to a psychiatric institution, remaining silent for 2 years. Her name, eventually given, was Anna Anderson. Her claim emerged gradually. She was Grand Duchess Anastasia. She claimed to be the sole survivor of the Yekaterinburg massacre. Saved by a sympathetic guard, she was brought to Romania, then Berlin. She tried to reach Romanovs' relatives in Copenhagen, but was turned away. Anna Anderson's case is one of the strangest obsessions of the 20th century. She lived with this claim for 60 years, She was examined by surviving Romanov household members and cousins. Their verdicts were divided, becoming part of the legend. Globotkin, son of the murdered physician, believed her completely. He advocated for her until his death. The Romanov family collectively and officially rejected her. Pierre Gilliard, the children's French tutor, initially uncertain. He later concluded she was an impostor and said so publicly. Her claim's durability came from her performance and psychological need. Many found a mannerism or knowledge that convinced them. Others found nothing recognizable at all. This split testimony extended the question into a perpetual argument. Her supporters said she knew things she should not have known. Detractors claimed the knowledge was explained by coaching and research. She bore resemblances to Anastasia, but differences were significant. Medical experts hired by the Romanov family stated this. Legal proceedings over her claims occupied West German courts from 1938 to 1970. The court ruled definitively against her claim in 1970. She moved to the United States in 1968 to Charlottesville, Virginia. She lived in increasing eccentricity, surrounded by animals and supporters. She died in 1984, never officially identified. She became a cultural archetype, the lost princess, the survivor. In 1997, the film industry gave this archetype an animated musical. Anastasia, produced by Fox, gave the legend a happy ending. The Soviet government maintained the family's ambiguous status. No official acknowledgement until Gorbachev's glasnost era. The location of the bodies was a state secret. Geologist Alexander Avdonin quietly investigated in the 1970s. He collaborated with filmmaker Jelly Ryabov. They found the burial site in 1979. They excavated briefly, confirmed their find, then reburied the remains. They told almost no one for a decade, fearing Soviet repercussions. The thing about the legend is that it did not die with the science. In a cultural sense, Anastasia's escape is more alive now than it was before the DNA evidence settled the question. The animated film has been adapted into a Broadway musical. The legend circulates through social media. New books appear regularly that are not about the forensic resolution, but about the mystery. Books that treat the question as still open when it is scientifically closed. Yes. This is not simply public ignorance. It is something more interesting than that. The figure of Anastasia serves a function that the facts of her death do not serve. She is a narrative of survival against impossible odds, of identity asserted against power, of the individual persisting when the state says otherwise. That the state in question was the Soviet state, system that denied the killing for decades and suppressed the burial site, made her a particular kind of symbol during the Cold War, when the West needed icons of resistance to communism's willingness to erase people entirely. The Romanovs themselves were canonized by the Russian Orthodox Church in 2000. Nicholas, Alexandra, and all 5 children recognized as passion bearers, a category reserved for those who died accepting death with Christian humility rather than resistance. The site of the Ipatiev house, which was demolished by a regional party official in 1977, a young Boris Yeltsin, carried out the order, bears the church on the blood. A large cathedral built over the foundations of the building where the family died. Pilgrims come there every July 17th. They walk through the night in a procession from the cathedral to the Ganina Yama, the mine shaft area in the forest where the bodies were originally taken. Some of them hold icons of the royal family. Some carry photographs of Nicholas or Anastasia. The church teaches that their deaths were a martyrdom that redeemed Russia, that the passion of the Romanovs was a spiritual act that closed an imperial age and opened something new. Whether you find this persuasive as theology is a matter of private conscience, as history it is a reminder that the dead do not stay where their killers put them. They migrate. They become something beyond what they were, beyond the specific contingent, historically located people who lived in whitewashed rooms and sewed jewels into their clothing against an uncertain future. The jewels, it should be noted, were recovered along with the bodies when the whites investigated the Ipatiev house. What was recovered there and what was found on the remains when they were buried and later exhumed formed a partial inventory of what the family had carried into captivity. The stones are in museums now. The guns used in the execution were claimed by various participants as souvenirs and eventually found their way into archives and collections. Yurovsky's pistol, a colt, was displayed in the Museum of the Revolution in Moscow. Yurovsky himself died in 1938 of a stomach ulcer, before Stalin's purges could reach him. He spent the years between the execution and his death working in party administrative roles. His Yurovsky note, the document that gives us the most detailed internal account of the night of July 16th, was not published until the Soviet collapse, kept, like everything else about that night, in a file that the state was not ready for the public to see. The last people who were in that room, Yurovsky and the handful of surviving guards who gave testimony, all described the experience as one they did not speak about. Not from guilt necessarily, or not only from guilt, but because the room itself was something they had difficulty fitting into ordinary language. It was small, it was loud, was over faster than the preparation for it, and slower than they had expected. None of them described it as clean. Nicholas II's last diary entry was written on July 13th, 3 days before his death. He noted the weather. He wrote about the family's activities. He made no reference to any premonition of what was coming, no record of any last message or final reckoning with his reign. He had been keeping the diary since adolescence, and he kept it in the same voice to the end. Careful, domestic, and almost entirely silent about the large forces moving around him. Anastasia's last known communication is a letter she wrote to a friend in May 1918 from Tobolsk, before the move to Yekaterinburg, is playful and teenage in tone. She writes about being bored. She draws a small caricature in the margin. She was 17 years, 1 month, and 12 days old when she died in a basement in the Ural Mountains. Having not escaped, having not survived. Having not made it to Romania, or to Berlin, or to a canal in February 1920, the legend of her survival is not a monument to her. It is a monument to what we wanted her to have done. That gap is where the 20th century lived, and where the ghost of the last Romanov still walks. In the silent white film that someone has painted over the windows, the story of the Romanovs did not end with the pull of a trigger in a Siberian basement, nor did it end with the final DNA match in a laboratory. It persists in the way we tell stories about the past, in the gap between cold, hard reality, and the enduring human need for the lost princess to have found her way home. History is often a series of whitewashed windows, obscured by those who wish to manage the narrative. But as the soil of the Ural Mountains eventually surrendered its secrets, we are reminded that truth finds a way. The diamonds may have been recovered, the guns may be in museums, and the bones may finally be at rest. But the hidden legacy of the Romanovs remains a permanent fixture in our collective memory. A reminder that while empires can be erased, the truth is much harder to kill. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Whispered Chronicles, Echoes of Forgotten Lore. If these journeys into the shadows of the past resonate with you, please consider subscribing to the channel and sharing this chronicle with others who seek the story's history tried to leave behind. Your support allows us to keep uncovering these quiet anomalies. Leave a comment below. Do you believe the legend of Anastasia persisted because of a lack of evidence? Or because we simply didn't want the story to be over? Until next time, stay curious and stay safe.